Things got interesting in the previous episode with the launch of the first artificial satellite, the Sputnik 1. Let's see how the story goes on in this third episode of the story of space exploration. Let's get to it.
That's 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The launch of the Sputnik 1 had not been the first human-made thing to get to space. That had been von Braun's V2 rocket in the Nazi Germany, which was a lot bigger than I expected. Von Braun had become a celebrity in the United States during the 50s, talking about space travel on TV and inspiring the nation even before they had begun.
If we were to start today on an organized and well-supported space program, I believe a practical passenger rocket could be built and tested within 10 years. Of course, it would be foolish to rush headlong into building a 4-stage rocket, man it with a crew, and attempt to fire it into an orbit without first following a step-by-step research and development program.
The Americans had modified the V2 and launched some flights to space, but those had just been suborbital flights in which everything came back down in a few minutes. An orbital flight changed everything.
The world has now been created. This first satellite was today.
It emanates radio signals every 3/10 of a second, charting its course as it streaks across the sky.
Radio signals can be picked up on 20 and 40 megacycles as it circles the Earth once every
We announce to the world that anyone with a shortwave radio can listen to Sputnik.
The Americans were terrified. Their Soviet arch-enemies had the power to launch things into orbit, and the public didn't like those bad news, and suddenly realized that the Soviets had better technology, about 3 years more advanced.
We were convinced as Americans, because we had so convincingly won World War II, that we were the dominant power in the world. We had to be. Missiles were being built. We were practicing as if there was going to be a third world war, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, here was this first man-made satellite being orbited by our arch enemy. So this was an enormous event. It took you from the realm of theoretical science fiction to reality. It was a reality that human beings could send artificial satellites into space. And that changed everything. It was one of those moments in history where all of a sudden, all of your thought processes changed.
So we could say that the score was Soviet Union 1, United States 0, von Braun 1, Korolev 1. But before they even had time to calm down, and just a month after the launch of the Sputnik 1, the Soviets did it again with the Sputnik 2, this time with a dog as passenger, Laika. The launch was very similar to the Sputnik 1. Same rocket, Baikonur Cosmodrome, Launchpad 1. Laika survived the launch, and estimates indicate that her health got worse over time and she died a few days after due to extreme heat and lack of oxygen. When he arrived at the US, von Braun was assigned to work on the Redstone missiles for the military. The US government was worried that they were falling behind the Soviets and pushed the launch of the Vanguard, the first American satellite project, which had been assigned to the Army years before. The launch was on December 6, 1957. Everything went as planned, for the first 2 seconds. The rocket lost thrust when it had only risen a bit more than a meter above the ground, went down and exploded. Although the established frontier between Earth and space is 100 kilometers of altitude, the atmosphere doesn't just stop. The Earth progressively disappears as you get further away. That means that the friction with the little Earth there is makes the bodies on lower orbits slow down little by little, which makes them lose altitude. That is to say, they decay until they enter the lower layers of the atmosphere and disintegrate like a meteorite. That provoked that exactly 3 months after its launch, on January 4, 1958, the Sputnik 1 disintegrated in the atmosphere. After that, the Sputnik 2 was the only satellite in space for a while. After the failure of the Vanguard, the project of launching the first American satellite was reassigned to the Redstone missile team, which von Braun was part of. They adapted the Redstone missile to be able to launch the Explorer 1 to orbit and named it the Juno rocket.
At Cape Canaveral, Florida, the Army's Jupiter C rocket is ready for America's second attempt to launch a space satellite. No relation to the IRBM Jupiter, this is a rebuilt Redstone, a 200-mile missile carrying, instead of a warhead, 3 stages of solid fuel booster rockets and the Explorer, a 6-foot bullet only inches across, crammed with electronic gear. 30 pounds of payload. This close-up of the United States edition of Sputnik was made at a press conference with leaders of the scientific teams, Dr. Werner von Braun, Dr. James Van Allen, and Dr. William Pickering, a 3-way collaboration between private industry, academic science, and the military. Jupiter C stands poised on its launching pad. The hours-long countdown approaches 0, a moment of enormous tension, for every missile launching is still an experiment. Any one of tens of thousands of things can go wrong, with catastrophic results. But all that can be done to assure perfection has been done. The moment is at hand. The countdown reaches 0. Some 3 minutes later, Explorer is in orbit, broadcasting to the world its coded scientific data. Cosmic ray intensity, meteor impact, solar radiation. These are the dry facts that will help carry man ever farther into the age of space.
The success of the Explorer 1 gave von Braun good reputation, and its most important discovery were the Van Allen belts, which were named after James Van Allen, one of the main scientists of the mission. The Van Allen belts are concentrations of charged and radioactive particles that form due to the interaction between a planet's magnetic field, in this case the Earth's, and the solar wind, whose particles get caught in the magnetic field that prevents them from reaching the Earth. Similar structures have been discovered in other planets with a magnetic field, such as Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune. The Sputnik 2 also disintegrated in the atmosphere on April 14th of that same year. Sputnik 3 and 4 weren't as successful as the previous ones. The launch of Sputnik 3 failed, and Sputnik 4 was sent to a too high orbit, so they weren't able to land it as it was planned. On July 29, 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known as NASA, was founded with peaceful non-military objectives. Von Braun and his team were relocated to this new organization. The chosen site for the launches was the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, the perfect location because it's one of the closest locations to the equator in the US, and it has nothing more than ocean to the east. Besides, there were missile launch pads all over the place. But why are these things important? For a rocket to get to orbit, it has to be going at a certain speed, and you can get advantage of the speed of the Earth's rotation, a little boost that saves fuel if you launch to the east, and that is bigger the closer you are to the equator. It's a bit hard to explain it fast with just words, so I'm going to use this whole overused globe. Can you see that even though the whole Earth spins at the same time, the places in the equator move faster? That gives rockets launching from near the equator a small boost. The Earth helps you if you launch towards the east, so it's great that there's an ocean that way. You really don't want a rocket booster falling on top of someone. Regarding the launch pads, rockets and missiles are really similar, so they can be adapted. While NASA was launching more Explorer missions, the Soviet Union began its Luna program with the Luna 1 probe, which became the first human-made object to escape Earth's gravity on January 2, 1959. Luna 2 was quite different though, because this time the Soviets shot the moon. Instead of getting close, the probe was actually launched on an impact trajectory, and on September 13, 1959, the probe crashed on the lunar surface and was completely destroyed. But not without before spreading some Soviet peanuts all over the place, of course. So no, the first flag on the moon wasn't one of the United States, but the Soviet one. Wait, this can be considered spoiler of future episodes. Cut! Luna 3 photographed the hidden face of the moon for the first time on October 4. Now that I mention it, I want to say that it's wrong to call it the dark side of the moon. The hidden face receives the same amount of solar light as the other one. In fact, it receives a little bit more because it's never affected by lunar eclipses. The reason why we can't see it is because the moon is tightly locked to the Earth. A very common phenomena with close orbits because the Earth attracts the face that is closer a bit more than the one that is further away. Due to the space race, it may seem like tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were being replaced by competition, but not even close. In 1959, the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis took place. The United States had nuclear missiles in Turkey threatening Moscow and Leningrad, so when Fidel Castro raised to power in Cuba and made it a communist state, he started negotiating with the Soviet Union and they began building nuclear missile launch pads that threatened the US. The Americans constantly sent spy planes to check the progress they were making, and to their surprise, they were already operational. The world was close to a nuclear war that would have made us go back to the Stone Age. The recently elected President John F. Kennedy had to deal with the situation. Against the opinion of most politicians who wanted to attack, Kennedy decided to put in place a naval block to Cuba as a preventive measure. He began negotiating with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union leader, and they finally reached an agreement. Both countries would remove the nuclear missiles from Turkey in the case of the United States and from Cuba in the case of the Soviet Union to avoid a catastrophic nuclear war. On August 19, 1960, the Sputnik 5 returned to Earth with some plants and animals that had been in space. Besides, this was one of the many and frequent tests of the Vostok capsule that the Soviets were getting ready. On October 10th of that same year, the Soviet Union launched a very ambitious mission heading to the Red Planet for the first time. But it failed because the probe didn't even get close. On February 12, 1961, they tried with Venus, and they succeeded. The probe passed very close to the planet. What a pity that communications were lost some time before and it was worthless. These were hard blows to the Soviet space program, but they had a secret weapon. Korolev and his team had been preparing and testing the Vostok capsule and the R-7 Vostok rocket, and they had finally finished. Its purpose? Launching the first human in history not just to space, but to orbit. On April 12, 1961, just 3.5 years after the launch of the Sputnik 1, Yuri Gagarin is waiting inside the Vostok capsule for the most important moment of his entire life. It was launched from the Soviets' favorite place, Launchpad 1 in the Baikonur Cosmodrome, which after this mission was renamed as Gagarin's Start. In case something went wrong during the launch, Yuri would be ejected from the capsule and would deploy a parachute.
В утренневостях жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой и юный, хотя впереди. И Ленин такой молодой и юный, хотя впереди. Весь летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой и юный, хотя впереди. И Ленин такой молодой и юный, хотя впереди. С неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой и юный, хотя впереди. И Ленин такой молодой и юный, хотя впереди.
According to the plan, Gagarin would be launched into a quite low orbit. He would then orbit the Earth just once and activate the retro thrusters to come back to Earth.
И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой и юный, хотя впереди. И Ленин такой молодой и юный, хотя впереди. И сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой и юный, хотя впереди. И Ленин такой молодой и юный, хотя впереди. С неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади.
If the retro thrusters failed, the orbit was so low that it would decay in just 10 days. So at least Gagarin would survive. The launch was relatively successful. Gagarin was in orbit, but in a slightly higher one than intended. which made him completely dependent on the retro thrusters if he wanted to come back home alive. Fortunately, the retro thrusters worked, and Gagarin could deorbit, although one of the key parts of the mission was still ahead, the reentry. The reentry is hard because you enter the atmosphere at orbital speeds of some kilometers per second, and you need a heat shield to prevent the capsule from disintegrating. The Vostok capsule, the reentry sphere, was all a heat shield to increase safety. I think I forgot a tiny detail, and it's that the parachute just slowed the ship down to about 10 meters per second, which could cause him contusions or broken bones on impact, so Yuri was ejected at 7,000 meters of altitude and landed with his own parachute. The Soviet Union denied for many years that Gagarin had been ejected, because the FAI wouldn't consider it a complete space travel if he hadn't landed with the spacecraft. It was when he got back that he said his most famous quote: "When I orbited the Earth in the spaceship, I saw for the first time how beautiful our planet is. Mankind, let us preserve and increase this beauty, and not destroy it." In this episode, we've seen what could be considered the Soviets humiliating the Americans in the space race. However, sometime before the launch of Gagarin, a group of men known as the Mercury 7 had been assembled out of pilots from the Army for NASA's manned space program, and they were planning something big for them. If you want to know what they achieved, subscribe, click the like button, and get ready for the next episode of the story of space exploration. Very soon on Planet Genesis.